Thank you, everybody, for joining us today for another session of the Program on Education Policy and Governance Spring Colloquium Series. We're thrilled to have you here with us today. If I could introduce our host, Katharina Werner is a postdoctoral research fellow here at the program. Katharina?
Thank you, Antonio. Yes, welcome also from my side. And for this exciting talk today, we have with us Anna Egalite, who is going to talk to us about the causal estimates of the effects of teacher-student race and ethnicity matching on student achievement. Let me quickly introduce Anna. So she's a, sorry, just one second. She's an associate professor at the Department of Educational Leadership, Policy and Human Development in the College of Education at North Carolina State University. And her research focuses also on particularly on closing racial and economic achievement gaps, looking at school choice policy, school size, and influences of family background on intergenerational economic mobility. So we're very excited to have her here with us today. For everybody in the audience, do remember that throughout the talk, you can ask questions. So we will have a discussion at the end as well. So feel free to ask your questions in the chat or raise your hand if you have an urgent or clarification question during the talk. And then we will kind of have a discussion at the end where we can also go more into depth on the specific topics. So with all that said, Anna, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. I have my chat box here, so feel free if questions come up during the presentation, just ask them right away, and then we'll also have more extended time to talk at the end. So this is work that's co-authored with Brian Casita from Mizzou and Dan Bowen from Texas A&M. And it is using the measures of effective teaching data, which is covering 6 school districts across the United States. And our topic here is looking at educator diversity. Specifically, we're looking at the teachers in this data set. And there's 2 reasons, I think, why this area of research is growing and has attracted so much interest in recent years. And the first trend or reason for that is the changes that are happening in the student body. So in both public elementary and secondary schools, we're seeing representation gaps between students and their teachers that have not improved over time. And we can look at this graphically. So this is the makeup of the teacher workforce for all public schools across the United States from the fall of 2000 until the most recent year of data that we have, which would be the fall of 2017. So at the start of that time period, you can see that teachers were overwhelmingly white at 84%. And by the end of this time period, the gap shrinks just a little, but it's down to 79% white. So an overwhelmingly white teacher workforce. In terms of Black and Hispanic, it goes from 8% Black to 7% Black over that time period, and Hispanic goes from 6% to 9%. So not a whole lot of movement in those other racial groups for teachers. But this is not mirrored among the students whatsoever. So over this same time period from the fall of 2020 to the fall of 17, the student body is changing. And so what we can do here is express this as a representation gap. So in the fall of 2000, like I just showed, we have this 84% of teachers were white. And at that time, it was 61% of students were white. So we had an overrepresentation of white teachers to the tune of 23 percentage points. So this gap of 23 points overrepresentation. And that gap actually grew over this 17-year time period. So now it's a 31-point gap, right? So teachers are overrepresented, white teachers. The signs are flipped for Black and Hispanic students because they're underrepresented among their teachers. So at the start of this time period, we can see that 9% of teachers were Black. 8% of teachers, but 17% of students. And that's where we get this 9-point representation gap. And it didn't really shift very much over this time period. So it's now an 8-point gap. And then we see the most dramatic change there among the Hispanic students and teachers. So at the start of the time period, 6% of the teachers identified as Hispanic compared to 10% of students. And so that's where we get this 10-point gap. And that has almost doubled, right? So now it's an 18-point gap. So much greater underrepresentation for Hispanic students. So there's lots of other ways to think about what this representation gap looks like within states or across the US. One way that researchers have expressed it is the probability that you would ever be assigned to a teacher who shares your race. And so, for example, in North Carolina, over half, so it's 56% of Black students in those elementary grade levels will never be assigned to a Black teacher, right, throughout their elementary and secondary career. Okay, so that's the first motivation for the paper, is this growing representation gap for students of color. And the second is that the research base, like I said, has been expanding. It's a really interesting topic for a lot of people, and it has developed a lot of knowledge about the benefits that students of color might experience from being assigned to a teacher who shares their race or ethnicity. And it's a rich literature at this point. A nice way to look at it would be this systematic review from 2019 by Chris Redding. And that paper, he summarizes 37 papers that are on this topic and groups them into these three broad categories. So we've got how teachers rate students in the classroom, like as being inattentive or completing their homework on time, following directions, right? So we can see racial patterns there. And also how teachers rate students' academic ability, whether they think they're high performing or low performing. Another set of outcomes that have been looked at are behavioral outcomes, things like student discipline and their likelihood of receiving a suspension, and if that's related to the race of the teacher as compared to the race of the student. And there is some evidence that that is the case. And then the third category, probably the biggest, because we have such accessibility to these data, and that scores on standardized tests. The most rigorous of these would be obviously the ideal scenario where you have randomization, and that is teachers randomly assigned to classroom groupings. And in Tennessee, Dee had that because it was a study of class size, a random assignment study of class size. And so he was able to leverage those data to look at effects of being randomly assigned to a same race teacher. And so across these three broad categories, Redding summarizes the literature by saying, yes, it seems to be apparent that Black students in particular experience differential benefits from assignment to a Black teacher across all three of these domains. The evidence for Latino students is a little bit more mixed, which is interesting. And as we're working through this paper, I'll show the results separately. And I think it's building a case for why we should consider these conversations almost separately, because they are different phenomena, different origins, different solutions. But just keep that in mind, that the evidence is not as clear. And then, if we get out of the world of short run impacts on things that are within that year or 1 year later and look at the long run effects, this is, I think, a very exciting line of research where we can say, well, exposure to a same race teacher in elementary or secondary school, does that influence anything much later in a child's life? And so there is one paper so far that has been able to do that, and the authors are cited here. And you can see high school graduation, they found a 9 percentage point advantage for students who had experienced at least one teacher of their race or ethnicity. And then college enrollment, a 6 percentage point advantage. So I guess we'll have to wait and see what happens with college graduation, right? There hasn't been a study of that further out than that. And this was done with the Tennessee STAR data, again, that class size data. So this was exposure during kindergarten through grade 3. And then they're looking much further along in that child's educational outcome. But they were able to replicate this using quasi-experimental methods in North Carolina. So that's lending some credibility there too, that they were able to find the same effects. So in terms of the theory, there's lots of opinions and sort of early theories about why we might observe this benefit. And there's a couple of pathways through which it might happen. So some of these mechanisms might be student driven. And so you can say, well, thinking of a role modeling effect, is the student responding to the teacher in a way that's altering their effort or behavior in the presence of a teacher who looks like them? And in this paper, we're going to look at that by subject, right? Because we think that might be experienced differently in a math classroom compared to an English language arts classroom, for example. Just to pause for a second about why that might matter. So this is a photo of my daughter in October 2018. So for Halloween, we dressed her up like Serena Williams in that famous catsuit. In reality, she'll probably never meet Serena, right? But we think it's really important for her to have strong role models. And, Serena is somebody who has challenged norms, consistently outperformed expectations, and broken new ground for women of color in many ways. And that's really impactful for a little girl who's trying to figure out her place in the world, right? And what doors might be open to her and what doors might be pushed open with a little nudge. So from a student's perspective, having a role model who looks like you maybe sends a signal about what's possible for people who experience the world like you. Maybe it tells them to update their beliefs about what could be possible for them. And maybe it's just generally inspiring and affirming and reassuring, and just a powerful symbol. So in this paper, we're going to try understand that a little bit by looking at how students report their classroom experience. Do they work harder? Do they exert more effort in the presence of a same race teacher? Do they feel like the classroom is a more welcoming place for them? So that's one pathway through which we might observe these effects. Another is that it might be coming from the teachers. The teachers might respond to students differently, right? Whether they're even aware that they're doing it, they might be reaching out and mentoring students that they recognize, or remind them of themselves perhaps when they were younger. And this might change the classroom environment in ways that better address the students' needs, whether that's academic needs or social needs about feeling of belonging and so on. Here's an example of some teachers that participate in an exchange visitor teacher program that we have in North Carolina. And some of them are teaching in bilingual public schools. Some of them are teaching in all English schools, but schools that are implementing this global learning curriculum. They're very experienced international teachers, and they come here on temporary, 3 to 5 year visas, and they share their culture and their language and their heritage with American students. So maybe it's something that the teachers are actively bringing to the classroom about their heritage and their background. And then the third pathway through which it might be operating is their constituents beyond the classroom, right? Maybe teachers of color are great at reaching out to community organizations and making those connections between families and home and the school, and that's what's making the difference. And of course, it could be all three of these, right? But the work so far has not really teased those pathways out. So we're trying to, that's one of our goals here today. So here are our three research questions. The first one is one that we've seen before, although what we think is unique here is that we're not relying on quasi-experimental methods like fixed effects models, like a lot of those 37 studies that Reading had identified that they're forced to do. We're actually going to be able to look at a random assignment situation, which is very encouraging, right? So we're excited about that. And then we're going to follow up by looking at student reports of how they're experiencing the classroom environment. That's their academic perceptions and attitudes. And then we'll also be able to look at teachers and how they, what their expectations for students are, right? And student ability and how they perceive students. And we'll see if that plays a role in the race matching effect. Like I mentioned at the outset, the data come from the Measures of Effective Teaching project. It's a 2-year project covering 6 school districts. They're listed here. You can see they're across the United States. What's key about this data set is that they randomly assign the teachers in year 2. So we'll be relying on year 2 of the data, where the school generated these classroom rosters. And then within a grade band, say you had 2 fourth grade classrooms, the teacher was randomly assigned. And so we matched what we've got on the demographic files with the surveys of both students and teachers, and then the district administrative data like the demographic information and the standardized test scores. So here is a sense of our final sample. Pretty representative perhaps of the US as a whole. Standardized test scores are, they're standardized by grade level within district. So that's their baseline scores the year before random assignment. And you can see the teachers there are majority white, 66%. So like we see across much of the US, only 7% are Hispanic. And some of them have about 29% have a master's or higher, some kind of specialist degree. And the average years of experience there are 4 years. And in terms of the match that students experience, so overall 42% of them experience a match, but that's very much driven by the white students. As you can see here, 80% of them are experiencing a teacher who is white. Black students, it's more like 51%, and Hispanic students have the lowest of those 3 groups. And unfortunately, we can't look at other racial groups because of just the data limitations. So those are the 3 that we'll be talking about today. Other just different ways we could break this out. So for students who receive free or reduced lunch, 29% of them experience the match. And for English language learners, it's 14%. In terms of the research design and how we're going to take advantage of that random assignment situation, We're going to be using instrumental variables. And so what you see here is the Black teacher was randomly assigned to this group of children. And so you can see in some cases there's a match, in some cases they're not, but there was imperfect compliance, right? So there's all kinds of reasons why classroom rosters get shifted up just before the school year begins. Maybe a student transfers out of the district, maybe a teacher is no longer going to be in teaching and needs to be replaced. And so there is imperfect compliance, but that's okay. So we can see the teacher they were assigned to, and then we can see the actual teacher that they experienced that year. And so we'll be using that to predict, using that compliance in the instrumental variables framework. So in the first stage, we predict who you actually experienced, who the observed teacher was. And we use assignment to predict the observed teacher, and it's pretty high. I think it's about, the first stage is about 0.71. And then in the second stage, we use that prediction of the observed teacher in the model so that we don't have to worry about non-compliance biasing the results. And so we can see the same race match there. For the first set of models here, Y is going to be the outcome there is going to be student test scores. We'll look at math and we'll look at English language arts, and we'll see if the same race teacher is associated with changes in that. One of the most important controls here is this theta B, and that's the fixed effect for randomization block. So that's where you have a grade level, you say you've got the 2 fourth grade classrooms and the teacher was randomly assigned. And so within that randomization block, we'll be conducting the comparison, and that will allow us to take advantage of the randomization. And standard errors are clustered by teacher. Before we look at any results, it's nice to just make sure that the random assignment worked as predicted. So we do this balance test across a couple of different characteristics. So student gender, free reduced lunch status, English language learner status, and then their baseline scores in those subjects. And we look at it within the 3 categories of students. So we would not expect to observe significant effects here if the randomization is working. And in the first, third, and fifth column, we haven't yet added those randomization block fixed effects. And so thankfully, when in 2, 4, and 6, columns 2, 4, and 6, most of those stars disappear as we would expect. And so that's giving us some reassurance that the sample is balanced across same race teachers. So that first question was asking if assignment to a teacher of color influences student achievement for Black and Hispanic students in that subject. And so we'll look at it here overall, and then we'll look at it for Black students separately and Hispanic students separately. And the overall, and the top panel here is math results, and the bottom panel is English language arts. And you can see there's not a whole lot going on in math, so null effects across all 3 columns. In English language arts, we see an overall, so achievement gain of about 5% of a standard deviation for students who experience the same race match in that year. When we break it out to look at Black students or Hispanic students, it seems to be driven by the Hispanic students here. So that's 19% of a standard deviation, and that's significant at p less than 0.05. This is the same results just visualized, depending on how you like to receive the information. Sometimes it's helpful to just see them side by side. So again, there's the math effects on the left, the English language arts on the right, and you can see that small overall effect in English language arts. That's that 5% of a standard deviation boost. And there's the Hispanic effect, approximately 19% of a standard deviation. So that's kind of interesting. Before we move away from standardized test scores, we want to unpack that a little bit further. So within Black and then within Hispanic, we can look at more subgroups. So what we have here, the first column is just repeating what you already saw, the overall effect for Black students. And then in the next couple of columns, we see Black male, Black female, Black elementary, and Black middle. So some interesting things here. So middle school math certainly seems to be a large effect there that would be considered large in educational terms, but nothing going on in English language arts. And then switching to Hispanic students, quite a few stars popping up here in the English language arts results. And so there's that overall effect that you already saw, that 19% of a standard deviation. When we look into, is it Hispanic male, is it Hispanic female, it's significant for the female students. And the elementary students, there's 1 star there, so maybe suggestive if we had more power, that might have become significant. But certainly the female Hispanic students are seeing a boost. One other nice little follow-up test we can do is this robustness test, where we say, well, because you were assigned to a same race teacher in math, we wouldn't expect that that would change your performance in English language arts and vice versa, right? So we can check that our models are working as we would predict them to do by running this falsification test. And so these results are a little bit reassuring. So we see there's the overall English language arts effect. When we do the falsification test, it disappears, right? So because we wouldn't expect that having a same race teacher in subject A would affect your performance in subject B. And similarly with the Hispanic students, where we had that overall ELA effect, that disappears when we run this test. And so giving us some more confidence in the approach that we're using. Okay, so we've established that there seems to be a small benefit for students who experience the same race teacher in math or English language arts. What can we unpack about what's going on in these classrooms that might help us understand that a little bit better? So we turn now to the student surveys, and this is the tripod survey framework, which has been used in lots of districts. Go ahead, Paul, jump in.
I'll save it to the end.
Okay, sure. So the students were surveyed across 3 broad categories: personal support, curricular support, and academic press. And I'll give you some examples of the items in those 3 categories. So personal support, that includes both care and confer. And there's some sample items here about my teacher makes me feel that they really care about me. My teacher checks to make sure I understand what they're teaching. That's personal support. Under curricular support, then the 3 categories are captivate, clarify, and consolidate. So some sample items: my teacher makes the lessons interesting, my teacher explains difficult things clearly, and my teacher takes the time to summarize what we learn. And then that 3rd category is academic press. So the items are challenge and classroom management. Some sample items: my teacher accepts nothing less than our full effort, and student behavior in this class is under control. There's so much on that student survey. We also include one other item that we thought was a little bit revealing, and that's happy in class. So it's literally just, I feel happy in this class. And there's some interesting things here. So there they are grouped. I just use color to make it easier to remember the 3 different categories. And quite a lot. So this is using the IV framework again. So using the instrumental variables framework, same that you saw before, except now we've changed out why. We're not predicting achievement. We're predicting how they respond on this classroom survey about their teacher. So students that experience the same race or same ethnicity teacher are more likely to say, say, for example, care. I feel like my teacher cares about me, 11% of a standard deviation higher. Or happy in class down here at the end, 9% of a standard deviation higher. We thought it would be interesting to break it out by subject. So we can look within the math classroom, and then we can also look within the English language arts classroom. I think this is kind of interesting. This is very much a working paper, so feel free to give us feedback as we talk about this. Maybe it's just interesting to us. But so the English language arts classroom, it's only significant at 10% here, but the care outcome is showing up in the English language arts classroom, but not in math. And then the clarify and consolidate. So clarify is significant in both classrooms, but it's much stronger in the math classroom. And maybe that makes a little bit of sense, right? So math might be a subject where more clear explanation is needed. And similarly with consolidate, maybe it's related to the type of instruction that's required in a math classroom relative to an ELA classroom. The last one where there's some interesting differences by classroom here is that classroom management difference. So the students are perceiving that the behavior is under better control in the math classroom relative to the ELA classroom. So that's students. So the 3rd question here then is getting at the teachers, right? So is there something about the teacher expectations of their students that might help us better understand why we were observing a same race effect on their test scores? So to do this, we are now going to switch to the teacher surveys. So they were given a teacher working condition survey. And this is building on an approach that Ferguson and Hirsch used, where they used 3 of the items from that teacher working condition survey to categorize teachers as believers or agnostic. That's their language. Okay. So we generate this believer index, and it's built from these 3 items. The teachers were asked, I believe almost every student has the potential to do well on a particular assignment. And you rate your response: strongly disagree to strongly agree. I require students in my class to work hard, and I believe that what I teach will make a difference in my students' lives. So we're taking the average of those 3 items by teacher, and using it to build this index that we're calling the believer index. It ranges from 1 to 4, right? So 1 was strongly disagree and 4 was strongly agree. And some interesting patterns in the believers. Okay, so who are the teacher believers, first of all, without even looking at race matching at all? Female teachers are more likely to be believers. It's not much of a difference. Their mean is 3.6. Males teachers, their mean is 3.56. Black teachers are more likely to be believers compared to white or Hispanic teachers, and teachers with an advanced degree like a master's or higher, they're more likely to be believers compared to those without. Although I have given you the means there, it's not a huge difference. And so what we're going to do here is incorporate the interaction into the model. So we're going to add in this believer index. So now you're not just assigned to a same race teacher, but it's interacted with whether that teacher is a believer on this scale or not. Still instrumental variables approach. So on the left-hand side, I've given you the results you've already seen, which is the overall results. And then on the right-hand side, I'm adding the interaction. How to think about interpreting the interaction. So among teachers who score higher on the believer index, that means they're more likely to just say strongly agree versus just agree with statements about student abilities. Is the same race match effect stronger for those teachers? And so we see here for Black students that that interaction effect is significant. So that would suggest that there is more of an effect observed for students who are assigned to not just a same race teacher, but a same race Black teacher who is a believer on those 3 items. That's math. And then looking at English language arts, for Hispanic students, where we had an overall effect for English language arts, again, this believer index seems to be explaining a little bit of what perhaps is happening here. So among teachers who are more likely to be believers, that is believing that in student abilities, the same race match effect is stronger for those Hispanic teachers. Okay, so what was our goal here with this research? First of all, we wanted to look at the, predicting the achievement effects like much of the literature has done, but using an instrumental variables approach to do it that we think is a little stronger than many of the fixed effects approaches that have been tried in the literature. And then also looking within subject area is maybe a different contribution of the paper. But then actually unpacking it a little bit more to understand the mechanisms of what might be happening. Is it student driven? Is it teacher driven? And it seems to be a little bit of all of this. So maybe we didn't make it very far in deciphering the race matching effect. But some other things takeaways from this work. So for example, the representation gap for students of color, they're lumped in together. I would say so even more so in this movement to use the term BIPOC, like Black Indigenous people of color, right? So making the conversation even broader, I think hasn't been helpful in understanding the race matching effect. And so I suggest here that we should be having these conversations about Black student representation separately from conversations about Hispanic student representation, in part because the origins of these gaps differ. The effects of closing the gaps might differ, right? Because we see different effects by subject, and the potential policy solutions might differ. I showed you some of those visiting international teachers early on a couple of slides ago. And so, they're here on exchange visas. Those are expensive to apply for. It's a lot of paperwork. So if we think that that's an important contribution to student learning, that solution is going to look very different from recruiting more Black teachers into the classroom. So I think moving forward, having those discussions in a little bit more of a fine-grained way than we have been having will be helpful in order to come up with something actionable like a takeaway. Also, just in terms of where this literature is going, there's only so many papers that will be informative on short-run effects. I think we really need to be focused now on longer-run effects, things like college graduation that we haven't seen effects for yet. And as we continue to have these conversations, efforts to diversify the pipeline are important, and the research is backing that up, but they don't happen in a vacuum. And so I think that we need to continue to talk about other initiatives and priorities that might be competing with those. So things like, for example, I cite here compensation reform as a priority and other things. Paul, I see your hand up. Your timing is perfect.
So that's a really interesting talk, and I have a number of observations. One of them is for Black students, you get quite different results in the literature. you're seeing overall no effects of same race match for Black students, when the literature sort of says, well, that's where we really see it. And that raises the question, why? And I think the literature is very heavily dependent on the Tennessee class size study. You may correct me in this regard, because I don't know every study out there, but the most widely cited studies come from Tennessee. And the Tennessee class size study, as I recall, is 1980s or is it 1970s data? So this is the United States 50 years ago, a half century ago. And so we are talking in contemporary language. We're saying race matching is essential because studies show that it is. We put that in the present tense, but we should be putting that in the past tense. We should say, in the 1970s, race matching was very important. It remains to be seen whether or not the United States has changed in the past 50 years. So I think that's one thing that might be thought about in thinking through whether or not your results for Black students. And then when you bring in the believers and the non-believers, maybe the difference is the non-believers are sort of a remnant of a past that is still around. So that's all possible. So that's one thing I would look at. The second thing that occurred to me was language. Is this really a race effect or ethnicity effect, or is it a language effect? And you didn't discuss that because I would think personally, I would be much happier in a class where they taught in English than if they were teaching in a language that was, I don't know any other language, but these kids do know two languages, at least to some extent, but everybody's happier when they are instructed in their native tongue, unless they really have been well taught in their secondary language. So I would think that's something that you didn't bring up that might be relevant to your discussion of where you see such sizable language effects. And then if the solution is language, if the problem is language, then we need to get people who speak, who can instruct in the native tongue of the Hispanic students. And one of the biggest barriers is certification. You didn't mention certification, but I once came across a bilingual school where most of the teachers were from Puerto Rico or from Cuba or from some, and they were all excellent teachers, but they weren't certified. So they were teaching in this private school instead of a public school where they could get a lot more money, but they weren't certified. So there's a huge barrier to qualified teachers who may have received their education abroad in some other country than the United States, because a lot of migration comes in by adults who may have been professional teachers in their homeland, but can't get a job in the United States. So looking at that barrier strikes me as something worthy of consideration. So yeah, I had some other points too, but that's enough to chew on for now.
No, that's great. There's a lot there. I had the statistic and I can't find it now, but I had it included and I deleted it to save time. But yeah, I agree about certification as a barrier. And if you look at the alternative certification pathways, Hispanic teachers are the highest recipients of alternatively certified licenses, right? Something like 30% of Hispanic teachers are alternatively certified. It's in the teens, right, for other teachers of other races. And so the ones that I showed pictures of are international teachers that are here on these temporary visas. So they wouldn't be certified in the US. They must be on these emergency licenses or some kind of, they call them lateral entry here too in North Carolina. But I agree with you that that is a policy solution that is going to be different for the conversation about Black teachers who are more likely perhaps to be native born. And some other things here that you raised, so like the language issue, we can't see, like for the teachers, like the data set doesn't say what's your first language, what's your second language, are you proficient or are you advanced? But as you're talking, it's getting me thinking like, well, we can't see that, but we can code the schools as a dual language school, right? So if you're going to be teaching in a dual language school, we might be able to infer that you're proficient in Spanish. And so maybe we could look at those as a breakout, as a school in which we can assume that the teachers have more language abilities, more foreign language abilities. And the other thing is, again, we don't really have the sample size here to look at it by district, but I do think moving forward in these state level studies, the makeup of students in different groups is going to vary by state. So for example, in Florida, the foreign born versus native born ratio for students, particularly Hispanic students, is much different than in some other states. And I think that might be playing a role too, right? So if you're an immigrant student arriving in the United States, your experience is going to be very different than one whose family has been here for a generation or so. And so that race matching or seeing a teacher that can speak your language or share your cultural background is maybe going to be experienced differently. So yes, understanding these things, I think, would be, they're limited by what data are collected, but I think there are some workarounds that we could pursue. On the question about the prior literature, finding a significant effects for Black students, like, yes, it does. And it gets a lot of play without actually dwelling on the effect size. Like, it's like 2 or 3 percentage points a lot of the time. It's not huge effects on their math or reading achievement. I don't think that's where that's why I think the long run effects are going to be more interesting.
But how about the time, I mean, just to follow up and say, how about the data was collected 50 years ago? What's your reaction to that?
Yeah, I agree with you. And it was collected in Tennessee. And I don't know, I think their study was, Dee's study was Black versus white. I don't think they even they didn't have enough students in the sample to look at Hispanic effects, right? That was a Black-white study. And so maybe that's part of the reason why so much of the conversation has been the Black student experience because of the prior literature.
If I can just jump in quickly, I'm also, because I'm in the moderator role, as well as having a question that I want to ask, just quickly encourage everybody else, if you want to ask a question, feel free to raise your hand. This is a meeting, so you will be able to use your microphone and camera if you want to. But first of all, thanks so much for this fabulous presentation. It's really, really interesting to wrap your head around. I was wondering if you could maybe say a little bit more for those of us who might not be perfectly familiar with the MET study, about how exactly teachers were kind of allocated to students in the data that you are able to study, because it's quite an unusual kind of circumstance, I suppose, and it might be a little different with how kind of teacher selection normally happens. And one of the things I was wondering while you were talking is kind of what the so I think the believer index, if you would put that in your balancing table, I assume it would also kind of like come up balanced across the different groups. But just if you have any sense of whether there's differences in how teachers select by race. So if you think that maybe labor market opportunities might differ for someone who's a young graduate depending on their race for whatever reasons, we might get a different type of person becoming a teacher. And so I have more questions about this, also kind of like how the negative signs show up when you include the interaction with the believer index. But just maybe if you could kind of start us off with talking a little bit more about the specific assignment mechanism in your case, and then kind of go from there.
Yeah, so it's very much a working paper. So we want to hear all your feedback and suggestions. With the Ferguson and Hirsch, how they used the believer information, yes, they generated the index too, but then they collapsed it into an indicator. So 1, 0. So if you were above the mean, you were a believer, and if you were below it, you were agnostic. That felt like it was throwing away information, because I think there's a difference between the strongly agree believers versus the agree believers. So we tried to keep it as on that 4-point scale. But if you think, I mean, we're open to suggestions of how you think we should incorporate that. I haven't added it to the balance table. That's a good suggestion. I will, just to confirm that it is balanced across same race assignment. Your question about how teachers were assigned to classes in the MET study is a good one, because it is a very unusual situation. It's not indicative of the real world teacher assignment, or even how a field experiment of your dreams might be designed. So it can only happen, first of all, within schools where there's multiple grade levels. Multiple classes at that grade level. So you have section A and section B, and they're both within the same grade band. And so the principal assembles the classroom as they normally would, using whatever criteria they normally use. So whether they group all the students who are of a certain ability, although we don't seem to see that, at least by same race matching, but they assemble the roster. Could be to do with parent input, could have some role, teacher preference could have some, well, in the terms of the assembly of the students, right? Teachers may weigh in on these students would be a good cohesive unit versus these wouldn't. And then you have 2 teachers, 2 sections. And so the random assignment is just, well, which section does that teacher get? That's the part that's assigned. They're already teachers at that school. They've been recruited by that principal or whatever reason they work at that school. And so the randomization part is just within, across those 2 sections. It is possible that there's more than 2 sections, but it's very rare. Most common is 2 4th grades, right? Let me see if I've addressed everything you said about the believers. We could dichotomize it. We could look at it as above or below, and maybe that would make the interpretation a little bit easier. Right now, you asked about the negative sign on the same race match effect. So that is the effect of same race matching when believer is set to 0. Right? Yeah. You're a hardcore non-believer. Yeah. So that in reality, right, it's not a group that we would actually observe because the mean is 3.6. Most teachers are, and that is a selected sample. Most teachers are believers. They have opted into a profession.
It's still you still get the same race, right? It's not a teacher effect, but it's a match effect of the same race. So that's like the differential still.
Yes.
Which is like, I'm guessing it's some kind of prediction out of the sample, but still.
Yes. Yeah. So we don't try too much to interpret that, but yes, you're right.
Just on that same point, is believer a covariate in the sense that that, or could it have been affected by the situation? I mean, what came first?
Oh, good question. Yeah, they were surveyed in year 1. So what's your perceptions of, and those questions about student ability and so forth. And then, so we use their year 1 survey in year 2 data. So it's not contemporaneous. Okay, we define you as a believer or not at baseline. And then we look at the race matching effect a year later and categorize you as a believer or not.
And so in terms of teacher quality measures, is there anything you can kind of draw into the data set, kind of going above the teacher survey that you have? Was there anything else in the teacher survey? I mean, of course, I think in a way the randomization helps you here because at least you have teachers at the same school, so they have gone through a similar selection process, so they might be comparable on a lot of measures. But in theory, there could still be differences in kind of how teachers are selected by race, just through principles or other mechanisms.
Yeah. So the strength of the data set is the randomization, but it's also the weakness of the data set that we have 1 year of outcome data, right? Mm-hmm. So it's not like, I mean, one approach that we have available to us is that we do have information on teachers' value added in prior years, but it's not a complete sample. It drastically affects our sample size. We add it as a control variable in some of the models. I haven't shown it here. It doesn't have a huge effect. It doesn't change a whole lot. And we received some feedback from some colleagues about, do you want to control for teacher quality or not? Because the implications for policy vary depending on how you specify the model. If teacher quality varies in some way is correlated with teacher race, if you control for that in the model, then that's not going to be indicative of the real world policy implication of your outcome of your study. So, I mean, I can add those tables back in. We add it as a control variable. It drastically reduces the sample size, but it doesn't drastically change the results.
I mean, that's super interesting. I mean, I guess whether it changes your policy implication depends on how you envision going about changing the kind of share of students that have the same race match, because of course, whichever way you choose in order to bring that about might also kind of then have knock-on effects on whatever teacher quality measures you might have.
Yeah, at no point are we saying, and the conclusion is you just need to have more teachers of color and then nothing else about them matters. Like, of course, other factors, right? They're whether they have a degree, whether they have experience, or like other things that predict teaching effectiveness are still in play.
I have another observation, which I just wanted to hear your thoughts on. So it looks like you find a different size of effects, or I mean, I'm not quite sure if the differences are significant. So kind of like how large the differences are in comparison to the standard errors of the estimates. But it seems like you find weaker effects for middle school. And so I was just wondering if you have any thoughts on that, if that is noise in the data, if there's something about variation, or if there's a story you would kind of want to tell about how maybe the importance of role models changes as somebody reaches adolescence. Although, I mean, I think you could probably easily come up with a story where you would say it might be more important in adolescence, but then of course also you get cumulative effects in education. So I'm not sure there's like a definitive answer there, but I was just wondering how you kind of view those results.
Yeah, I agree. It's interesting. I think part of it here is the self-contained nature of an elementary school classroom. So your teacher you're going to spend more time with that person than with a parent or any other mentor in your life, because you have them for English language arts and math and some specials. So you're literally with that person all day long. Whereas in the middle school grades, there's more movement, right? So I have this teacher for 40 minutes, but now I'm going to go down the hall and I have a different teacher. So I think that's part of the difference between the elementary experience versus the middle school experience, is just that cumulative hours of exposure in the day. And so how influential this person can be.
But so your student survey measures are subject specific, right? So it's like happy in the English classroom, or
yes, yeah, and they're worded like the teacher in this classroom. Yeah. I agree with you. There's some interesting literature there on adolescence as being this time when a student's identity develops in ways that are more, I mean, what's the way to describe it? But more fine-tuned, more complex, right? Your social identity of, oh, what does it mean to be a person of this race, and understanding of the history associated with that. Like, it is a lot more complicated as the students get older. And so it's another reason we might see differences. I don't know how to interpret that as, should we predict that a race matching effect would be stronger then or weaker? But it's a different period of development. Paul, I see your hand up.
Yeah, no, if others have questions, they should go first. But just to continue this discussion of language, it seems to me mostly your findings are null findings. You're really, clearly a positive effect is in reading for Hispanic students. That's your significant finding. Mm-hmm. So it's not for, you do see it for the sample as a whole, but it's driven almost entirely by that very strong reading effect. And, that just sort of stands out for me, that, and then also it's stronger at the elementary level and at the middle school level. So, that just sort of emphasizes how important language acquisition is, and the specific barriers that Hispanic students have to overcome, and how advantageous bilingual instruction can be for perhaps for students who have a Latino background. So I would think that's sort of, to me, the takeaway point. And so the way you framed it in general is that you're seeing class size effects, but I think you're not finding, you're finding race effects, when I think you're actually finding not race effects. And so on the believer side, you had math and reading, and you saw significant effects in reading and not in math, but they weren't significantly different from one another. One was significantly different from a null effect, but the language effects were more similar than they were. I didn't see anything outside the error term. So I just sort of felt like you could frame this somewhat differently as showing departure from the standard, from the conventional wisdom out there. So what's your reaction to that?
Yeah, that's really helpful. Like I said, it's a working paper. We're still thinking about how to position it and frame it as what's our contribution here. I could speculate too and say, what the study I would love to do next, which is related to what you just said, is looking at how the I mean, are these Hispanic teachers, how many of them are coming in from outside of the United States? And so their training might have been different, and particularly the approach to phonics versus whole, the reading wars has been such a hot topic in the United States. I feel like ed schools have gone around in circles where we teach it this way, no, we teach it that way. Whereas at least I did teacher training in Europe, right? And we had hardcore phonics and very step-by-step pedantic. First you teach this letter sound, then you show them how to combine the letter sounds. And so maybe that's part of the story too. Like, it would be so wonderful to be able to explore that if the data permitted that, but we can at least suggest it as a pathway for better future work in this area.
Also kind of related to this, you mentioned in your introduction that actually the underrepresentation that students experience in the education system seems, or is definitely much more pronounced for Hispanic students. And then you also, I think, show this increase over time. So do you think that some of the effects could be, is this growing pains in a way that maybe there's more movement in those kind of segments of the population in the current period in time? And is there a kind of is that why the representation is kind of still kind of getting so much worse for those students in particular, that it just takes some time for the teaching force to adapt to the population? Or
yeah, I mean, that's absolutely what's driving the growth in the representation gap, is that the student body is changing, but the teacher workforce is not. And that's particularly visible among Hispanics, right? So we have seen much greater growth in that portion of the student body, but among the teachers, it's almost holding.
But to follow up on Katharina's point there, the U.S. Hispanic population is young, very much younger than the white population. And it's sort of very similar to the voting studies. Yeah, Latinos don't vote. Well, why don't they vote? They don't vote because they aren't eligible to vote. They're under the age of 18. Many of them are not citizens. There's all kinds of barriers to their getting all the wherewithal to become a voter. So this is all equally true of getting certified to be a teacher. You have to be a certain age, and you had to have a certain set of experiences, which you're unlikely to have if you're a recent migrant. So it's not exactly like voting because the barriers are different, but it's utopian to think that you're going to close this gap immediately. Mm-hmm. I've sort of felt like setting it up without taking into account some of the sort of demographics that were necessarily shaping this differential, sort of made it sound like this was a willful policy rather than sort of an inevitable concomitant of where we are. And so it's a little bit of both, but to sort of frame it in a way that takes into account that it's a little bit demography and a little bit policy.
Yeah, I love that. That's very helpful. And that's what we were shooting for in the conclusion by saying the solutions look very different. If the solution is to improve representation among Hispanic teachers, it's not the same as what's going to improve representation among Black teachers.
Now that's super interesting, and also kind of like you're finding overall that there's just large differences by race within these groups. And I mean, of course, power is kind of a challenge in your study as well, which is, I guess, one of the other downsides of kind of like randomized assignment, that it tends to be harder to implement and the samples tend to be so much smaller. But it's definitely such an interesting impulse to kind of look more closely at all of those kind of differences.
Yeah. Well, and the origins of the gap, like we haven't really spoken about that, but it was in large part desegregation that resulted in having so few Black teachers, right? Because Black schools were closed and students were sent to white schools where there were already white teachers. And so we lost a large portion of the teacher workforce in that movement. after 1954. So that origin is much different than why do we have fewer Hispanic teachers, right? It's a different story. So I just think we need to take separate paths with these, and both stories are important. I just think that they deserve different discussions.
Absolutely. All right, we're just coming up on the hour. So if anybody has any questions they would like to ask, now is basically your chance to speak up. You can use the raise hand button if you prefer, or just unmute. And otherwise, if that is not the case, I would like to thank you so much, Anna, for this really fascinating presentation. So much to think about, and really exciting to see kind of thoughtful studies on these kind of important issues in the education space. So thanks so much for coming to visit us. For everybody else, please do come back and join us for our last installment of the PEPG Spring series, which will be next week, same time, same place. And Raji Chakrabarti will be talking to us about local spending. So thanks everybody again. Good to see you, and hopefully speak soon.
Thank you.
everybody.